Let me start off by saying thank you for inviting me to give this presentation. I'm aware I've got 12 minutes, and so I'll try to fit everything in within the time that I have. I joined this group. I think it's a great group, and I wanted to learn more about it. I'm not strictly a deception researcher myself, but certainly my colleagues are, and I know at least one of them is in the room, and I scanned through the people who have joined. And we had a bit of a discussion about how this particular work on exploring the use of rapport in professional information gathering contexts is relevant to deception researchers. And of course, the general idea is that the more information you can get from people, the more chance you have about using some other tactics to be able to look at deception. And so there's my link, and I'd be happy to also have a bit of a discussion about that or answer questions at the end. So we actually did a systematic review, a narrative systematic review, rather than a meta-analysis that I'll be talking about. And for those of you who haven't read it, this is our paper. It's open access, so you can take a look. We were interested in studies that looked at building rapport. It could be in any professional information gathering context. Most of the time that included investigative interviews or intelligence interviews, but sometimes it was also things like counselling context or more medical context. And this work was not just me, it was a group of us. So I worked with Lorraine Hope, Kirk Luther, Gordon Wright, Gavin Oxborough, and Magdalene as well was our researcher on the project. So thought we'd start off by thinking about what rapport is. I know some of the names in the audience will be very familiar with this, but it's one of those funny things in that we've all got our own definitions of rapport, but those definitions might differ ever so slightly. And so I put together a selection for you to consider. And when I read them out, just see whether they match your own idea of rapport. So think about times where you have had rapport with someone or where you absolutely haven't had rapport with somebody. Like, how did that feel? So researchers have defined it as follows. Rapport is a feeling state experienced in interaction with another as interests, positivity, balance. It's a perception of having an enjoyable interaction characterized by personal connection between two interactants, a working relationship between an operator and a source based on mutually shared understanding of each other's goals and needs, or a bond or a connection between an investigative interviewer and an interviewee. And so I think we can probably relate to all of these definitions, even though they're all slightly different. The important thing, or the interesting thing for me, is that regardless of how it has been defined, from the available research that's out there, we know that research findings have shown that developing rapport facilitates cooperation and ultimately information elicitation. And those of you who are aware of the research that I conduct, I'm interested in different ways, different techniques to maximize the amount of reliable information that will inform whatever the investigation is. We know from specific studies that interviewers who make an effort to develop rapport are found to elicit significantly more detailed and accurate memory reports. So more information, but also more accurate information has been demonstrated in the literature. And that can be from witnesses, suspects, and in intelligence gathering context. So that really covers the range from cooperative witnesses, for example, who want to talk to the police, for example, through to perhaps uncooperative suspects who really don't want to engage. And in fact, in the systematic review that we did ourselves, we identified 35 studies, and 32 of them reported either full or partial support for positive effects of rapport on disclosure. So really promising, like worth looking into this idea of what rapport is. Sorry, I keep pressing the wrong button to go forward. So what is the problem? We know that it has a range of beneficial outcomes in professional settings, and so it seems as if there isn't a problem. But in fact, as well as conducting research in this area and investigative psychology in a broader context, I also do some work with the police and also look at training investigators. And I thought that it was a real problem, and other people have mentioned this problem as well, in that other than being told to build rapport, there's very little guidance about how to build rapport, what rapport is. And you've seen yourselves that there's a number of different definitions. So depending on what research article you go to, you might get a different definition of rapport, a different way of training it, a different way of measuring it. And this can be really difficult for any kind of practitioners trying to use these techniques, or trainers trying to train these techniques. So it's problematic that the scientific evidence base has minimal consistency in these definitions, in the way in which it's been examined, manipulated, and measured. And we really do need a more robust evidence base to inform both the training and the measurement of rapport. So you can understand what it is. It's very difficult to teach a whole group of people how to achieve it. And then even if people are thinking that they're doing a good job, the fact that there's so many different ways to measure it, again, is very difficult. So we tried to collate together all of the information to really try and make sense of this quite a big literature. So our goal, our objective, was to produce a systematic map of the rapport literature. And I'll explain a little about what we mean by that in a second. We wanted to identify studies that either that manipulated and or measured rapport. They had to be within an information gathering context. And then once we had located those studies of interest, then we wanted to catalogue various different characteristics in what we call a systematic map, which is really just a very well organized and searchable Excel file that's open access. So you can all download this and take a look at it yourself. And we catalogued the available research, the studies that we found, in different ways. So we looked at how rapport had been manipulated or trained. We looked at how rapport had been measured. And then once we had organized our systematic map, then we grouped studies in many, many different ways. I don't have time to go into all of our different findings, but we grouped them and then we produced our narrative systematic review. So we had our inclusion and exclusion criteria very quickly. We looked at lab studies and also field studies. Lab studies were eligible if they had some kind of experimental manipulation of rapport within the context of interest, and they had some kind of comparison condition or control condition and a measurement of rapport. And field studies were eligible for inclusion, provided that they were in the context of interest and that they provided sufficient detail regarding their methods that allowed us to understand how they contextualized rapport, how they understood, how they coded for rapport behaviors, for example. So if sufficient information was available within people's method sections, then we extracted that information to put in our systematic map. With our keywords, we had a number of keywords that we took a lot of advice on, and we had a number of different databases that we searched through. We also did hand searches. We put calls out to various different groups, such as the Investigative Interview Research Group. Anyway, after removing duplicates, we still had a large number of studies, 4,758 to be specific. And after we had gone through all of our inclusion and exclusion criteria, we ended up with 35 that focus on adults. So we did also collect studies that focused on children. If anyone's interested in that, I can talk a bit about that. Our research questions: what were the characteristics of this body of research, including the diversity of disciplines, different paradigms that had been used, different research designs? How has rapport been manipulated, operationalized, and how has it been measured? And today I'm only going to have a chance to talk about the middle one that I've highlighted in yellow. But again, if anyone's got questions about the others, I'd be happy to answer them. This is just a screenshot of our searchable systematic map if people haven't seen it. So like I said, it's available on the Open Science Framework. The link is provided in our paper. And it allows you to select the column of interest. So this screenshot just shows you the studies down the left-hand side, and then this particular screenshot shows the verbal rapport components. So things like use of name, or use of self-disclosure, active listening, things like that. And if a study has incorporated one of these techniques, then we put a yes. And so it allows you to click on the arrow and just say, for example, you're interested in active listening, then you can use this arrow to just select the studies that incorporated active listening as a means to build rapport with somebody. So it's very usable for academics and also practitioners. And then I just thought I'd summarize some of the main rapport behaviors that we were noticing across the different studies. So if it was, like I said, if it was mentioned in the method section as something that was either trained, so for example, they maybe researchers maybe had a group that were trained in rapport behaviors and their training involved active listening and showing a personal interest. If they had mentioned that, then it was in our systematic map, and then we collated it to see how many studies were using these particular techniques to gain rapport with another person. And there were more rapport behaviors than are listed in this table, but these are ones that hit a certain criteria. They featured across a number of studies and ordered in percentage of studies that they featured in. So we had a range of verbal rapport behaviors and non-verbal rapport behaviors, and then paraverbal is things like tone of voice, like pleasant tone of voice. And we listed these because it's quite useful to get an understanding of what we mean by rapport behaviors. But then we took it one step further when we were really thinking why people were using these behaviors, which I'll pick up on in a second. So when we went through and looked at our data, first of all, we looked at relative areas of concentration and inattention. And so we could look at that to see, for example, the percentage of studies who had used a particular rapport behavior and what was relatively new emerging areas of interest. We found that there were relatively low percentages that looked at each individual rapport behavior. And another problem we found is that across studies, people had combined them in all different kinds of ways. And so it was very, very difficult. Like, I wouldn't be able to answer the question if you said, or which is the most effective behavior to build rapport, because people rarely looked at them in isolation, and they rarely looked at them in the same combinations of things. I don't necessarily think that's a problem, but it's interesting to think of how people have operationalized these things. With measuring rapport, again, very little consistency, but because, of course, each of these studies did have some kind of measurement of rapport, then this tells us that measurement of rapport is possible. We know ourselves that we can understand when we do have rapport with someone and when we don't have rapport with someone. And there's a number of different questionnaires that can be given to somebody, either to the interviewee to rate how much rapport they felt with the interviewer, and vice versa. The interviewer is able to fill out a questionnaire to say how much rapport they felt there was in the interview. But also we're able to successfully observe rapport in other people. And I would say that Lawrence Allison has got quite a complex but a very thorough way of observing rapport behaviors. And the important thing, of course, is that there's consistency in people's ratings of rapport using these kind of measurement techniques, whether that's a technique to observe behaviors or whether it's a validated questionnaire. But also to interpret the data, it was important to us to have a look at what kind of themes there were across the different studies. And by doing that, we didn't just look at the rapport behaviors, but it was really important for us to think, what were the goals of using that behavior? Like, what is the function of that behavior? Why are they using this? What are they trying to do by using this combination of behaviors to build rapport? And we had the idea that the behaviors are manifestations of some underlying goal that serves to build rapport. So what do I mean by that? Well, here are the same behaviours that I presented to you previously. My last table showed you the verbal and non-verbal and paraverbal behaviours. But this time we looked at what was the goal, what was the function of each behaviour, and we recategorised them. And of course, each behaviour might have a different goal, but we looked at what the researchers writing the studies had how they had interpreted their findings, their understanding of rapport, and also from our own discussions. And we thought, for example, the top three, so showing a personal interest or reciprocating with information, trying to find that common ground, also use of self-disclosure and use of an interviewee's name are all different ways of building a relationship or personalizing an interview. The next three, so using a pleasant or a conversational tone of voice rather than any kind of coercive tone of voice, smiling, general friendliness, open body language, all of these are ways of presenting yourself as somebody who's approachable, someone who's welcoming you to talk to them, inviting you to talk to them. And then the last four, active listening, use of empathy, good eye contact or appropriate head nodding at the right times, all ways of demonstrating that you're paying attention to the person. And so we concluded our narrative review of the available literature that these are really key ways of being able to build rapport with somebody. So building that personal relationship, being approachable and inviting, disclosure, and demonstrating that you're interested and paying attention in what is being said. And so how can we use this to inform the next steps for both practitioners but also academics? We know for practitioners and trainers that the fact that there is consistency across studies to develop rapport, that's really useful. It can be used to inform training, especially when you think, what is the intention behind using the behavior? So you don't have to use all of those behaviors. It might even be impossible to use some of the behaviors depending on what medium you're using. For example, if I'm speaking to you over the phone, then there's no point using like certain behaviors that you can't see. But if you think about what the common ways are that people have used to develop rapport, and you think about the intention behind them, then that can be quite useful to inform training. Measurement of rapport seems possible. That's a positive thing. It is possible to rate people's experience and feelings of rapport, and it also seems possible to observe rapport in others. So again, for training, this is a positive thing to see whether you're improving on some of these skills. But also it revealed some questions in gaps. And so certainly a big one that I encourage people to look at if you're interested in this area of research is to look at cultural differences. It's very Western centric. So we know how to build rapport professionally with Western interviewees, but whether these things hold, for example, eye contact might not be the best way to build rapport with people from different cultures. Also, there are individual differences, of course, in interviewers. Some people are very natural in these rapport behaviors. Can everyone be trained? We don't know. Does it matter if rapport is genuine and mutual? I think this is a big topic, pseudo rapport, and whether the idea of rapport being mutual, but does it have to be mutual if it's a professional interaction, as long as you're taking steps to build rapport and be respectful and build that relationship if it's possible to build, then is that enough? It was interesting that researchers rarely examined rapport ratings as a mediator or moderator to look at the amount of information reported. And so, for example, you might have a group that was trained in rapport and a group that wasn't trained in rapport. But to what extent was the group that were trained in rapport actually effective in managing to achieve this mutual rapport? And the people who did achieve this mutual rapport, did they elicit even more information? Like this is still unknown and a bit of a discussion point. So I'm hoping to have some interesting questions surrounding some of these. Thank you very much.